I heard my daughter-in-law laugh softly before she said it. Helen is just someone we take care of now. And in that moment, surrounded by crystal glasses and polite smiles, I realized I had already been erased from my own family long before that night. The room was warm with candlelight, the kind of soft golden glow meant to make everything feel intimate and celebratory. But I felt cold sitting there at the end of the long dining table, my hands folded neatly in my lap, as if I were a guest who didn't quite belong. It was supposed to be a simple anniversary dinner for my son Daniel and his wife Melissa, something elegant but relaxed, hosted in the very house my late husband and I had spent 38 years paying off, decorating, and filling with memories. I had even worn the navy dress Robert used to say brought out the color in my eyes, smoothing my silver hair carefully before coming downstairs, telling myself that tonight would feel like family again. For a while, it almost did. The plates were set perfectly, the conversation light, glasses clinking gently as Melissa described their recent trip to Napa Valley, her voice smooth and practiced, drawing attention without ever asking for it. Daniel laughed at all the right moments, nodding along, barely glancing in my direction unless it was absolutely necessary. I noticed these things the way you notice a draft in a room you've lived in for decades, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. When the laughter died down, Melissa leaned back slightly in her chair, her manicured fingers resting on the edge of her wine glass, and that was when she said it. Not loudly, not angrily, just enough for everyone to hear. A statement, not an insult. That was what made it worse. No one corrected her. No one even shifted uncomfortably. Daniel gave a small smile, the kind that avoids conflict, and someone across the table let out a quiet chuckle, as if it were a harmless observation instead of a quiet verdict on my worth. I kept my face still. I even allowed a small smile, one I had perfected over the years, the kind that reveals nothing. Inside, something settled into place with a clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even sadness. It was understanding. I had spent years believing that the distance, the small exclusions, the forgotten invitations were accidents, misunderstandings that could be explained if I just remained patient, if I stayed kind, if I didn't make things difficult. But sitting there, listening to the soft hum of conversation resume as if nothing had happened, I realized this wasn't new. This was simply the first time they had said it out loud. I glanced down at my plate, untouched, the food already cooling, and noticed how my name card, placed almost as an afterthought at the far end, was slightly crooked. A small detail, easy to fix, but I didn't reach for it. I didn't say a word, because for the first time, I wasn't trying to correct anything. I was paying attention. I did not leave the table right away, even though every instinct told me to stand up, to excuse myself, to disappear into the quiet of my room where no one could watch me pretend everything was fine. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, listening as the conversation shifted back to safer topics, as if my existence had been neatly set aside like an empty plate. Melissa began discussing renovation ideas for the kitchen, her voice light and confident, describing changes to cabinets, countertops, even the dining space itself. She spoke as though she had already made the decisions, as though the house were already hers to reshape. I noticed how she gestured toward the walls, the windows, the very structure of the home, and no one questioned it. Daniel nodded along, occasionally adding a suggestion, his tone casual, as if these plans had been discussed many times before. I realized then that I was not simply being overlooked. I was being quietly removed from the equation. When dinner ended, I helped clear the table out of habit, stacking plates carefully, rinsing them under warm water, even as Melissa waved a dismissive hand and told me I did not have to bother. I smiled and continued anyway. It was easier to keep moving than to stand still and feel the weight of what had just happened. The kitchen lights were brighter than the dining room, harsh in a way that left no shadows to hide in, and I caught my reflection briefly in the window above the sink. I looked composed, calm, exactly the way they expected me to look. Later that night, when the house had grown quiet and the last of the dishes had been put away, I walked slowly through the hallway, my footsteps soft against the hardwood floors that Robert had insisted on refinishing himself all those years ago. Every corner of this house held a memory, not loud or dramatic, but steady and familiar, the kind that builds over time without announcing itself. I paused near the study, the door slightly ajar, and noticed the faint glow of a laptop screen. I would have kept walking, but something about the way the light flickered caught my attention. I stepped closer, not out of suspicion, not yet, but out of a quiet pull I could not quite explain. The screen displayed an email, still open, the text large enough to read without trying. I did not mean to look, but once I saw the first line, I could not look away. It mentioned property valuation, timelines, and a phrase that settled heavily in my chest: transition plan. I stood there for a long moment, reading just enough to understand that conversations had been happening, plans had been forming, and my name was not included in any of it. There was no anger rising inside me, no immediate reaction at all, just a steady awareness, growing clearer with each passing second. I closed the door gently without touching the computer, without leaving any sign that I had been there, and continued down the hallway as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind refused to stay quiet any longer. The house was still, the kind of stillness that used to feel comforting but now felt hollow, as if something essential had been quietly removed. I moved through my routine the same way I always had, measuring coffee into the machine, waiting for the soft hum and familiar aroma to fill the kitchen, pouring it into the same ceramic mug Robert had given me years ago. Nothing had changed on the surface, and yet everything felt different. I sat at the small breakfast table by the window, watching the early light stretch across the backyard, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to think clearly about the past few years. The small moments I had dismissed began to line up in my mind, one after another, like pieces of a pattern I had been too willing to ignore. There had been the holidays when plans were changed at the last minute, the invitations that never quite reached me, the conversations that seemed to pause whenever I entered the room. I had told myself it was nothing, that families went through phases, that I should not take things personally. But now, sitting there with the quiet pressing in around me, I saw it differently. None of it had been accidental. It had been gradual, careful, almost polite in its execution. By the time I noticed, there was very little left of the place I once held. Later that morning, I heard footsteps upstairs and the low murmur of voices carrying down the hallway. Daniel and Melissa were awake. Their conversation was not loud, but there was a tension in the tone that made me pause halfway up the stairs. I did not intend to listen, but again, I found myself standing still, just out of sight, as Melissa spoke with a firmness I had come to recognize. She was talking about timing, about making sure everything was handled efficiently, about avoiding unnecessary complications. Daniel responded more quietly, his voice uncertain in a way I had not heard since he was a boy, but he did not disagree. He never disagreed. I stepped back before I could hear more, not because I needed confirmation, but because I already understood enough. Whatever plans they were making, they had moved far beyond simple ideas. They were preparing to act. I returned to the kitchen, rinsed my cup, and placed it carefully in the sink, my movements steady and deliberate. There was no rush, no panic, only a quiet clarity that settled deeper with each passing moment. I had spent years believing that patience and kindness would preserve my place in this family, that if I continued to give without asking for anything in return, it would be enough. But now I saw that silence had been mistaken for weakness, and absence from their decisions had become the foundation of their confidence. I dried my hands slowly, glanced once more around the kitchen that had once been the center of everything, and realized that I was no longer trying to understand their behavior. I was beginning to anticipate it. That afternoon, I moved through the house more slowly than usual, not because I was tired, but because I was paying attention in a way I had not allowed myself to before. Every detail seemed sharper, every sound more deliberate, as if the house itself were quietly revealing things I had overlooked. I opened drawers I had not checked in months, straightened stacks of documents, and let my hands linger over papers that once felt routine, but now carried a different weight. When I reached the study later in the day, the door was closed, which was unusual. It had always been a shared space, never locked, never claimed by one person alone. I paused for a moment before turning the handle, finding it unlocked, just as it always had been, but something about the simple act of entering felt different. The desk was neat, almost too neat, with a careful arrangement that did not belong to me. I sat down slowly, pulling the chair in without making a sound, and opened the drawer where Robert had always kept important documents. The folders were still there, but some had been shifted, reordered in a way that felt intentional. I did not rush. I moved each file aside with steady hands until I found what I was looking for, not because I knew it would be there, but because I needed to see for myself how far things had gone. There were copies of property records, updated valuations, and printed emails that matched what I had glimpsed the night before. Dates, figures, signatures, all laid out in a way that suggested preparation rather than possibility. I read each page carefully, not skimming, not reacting, simply taking it in. The language was formal, detached, speaking of assets, transitions, and future arrangements as though I were no longer part of the present. There was even a draft timeline, measured in weeks, outlining steps that would lead to decisions being finalized. My name appeared only once, in a context that felt less like inclusion and more like an obstacle to be managed. I placed the papers back exactly as I had found them, aligning the edges, closing the drawer without a sound. There was no need to confront anyone, no need to ask questions that would only lead to rehearsed answers. Instead, I stood there for a moment, looking around the room that had once been filled with Robert's quiet presence, and understood something with complete certainty. This was no longer about misunderstandings or hurt feelings. It was a plan, careful and patient, built on the assumption that I would remain exactly as they saw me. I left the study the same way I had entered, quietly, closing the door behind me, and as I walked back down the hallway, I felt a shift settle into place. Not a reaction, not an impulse, but a decision. If they had taken the time to plan, then so would I. The following day, I left the house earlier than usual, not announcing where I was going, not offering any explanation, because none was asked and none was expected. The morning air was cool, carrying a quiet stillness that felt almost unfamiliar after the tension inside those walls. I drove the same route I had taken countless times over the years, past the grocery store, past the small park where Daniel used to play as a child, past places that once held meaning but now felt like distant markers of a life that had shifted without my consent. My hands rested steadily on the steering wheel, my movements calm, deliberate, as if I had already accepted what needed to be done. When I arrived at the office building downtown, I sat in the car for a moment before stepping out, not hesitating, just allowing myself a final breath of clarity before moving forward. The building itself had not changed, its brick exterior and glass doors exactly as I remembered, a quiet reminder that some things remained constant even when everything else did not. Inside, the receptionist looked up with a polite smile, one that turned into recognition after a brief pause, and she greeted me by name. It had been years since I had last visited, but not everything had been forgotten. I was asked to wait, and I did, sitting in a chair that felt both familiar and distant, my hands folded neatly in my lap once again, just as they had been the night before. When the door finally opened, I stood and walked in without hesitation. The man who greeted me had aged, just as I had, but his presence carried the same quiet steadiness I remembered from years ago when Robert handled matters that required careful attention. We exchanged a few simple words, nothing unnecessary, and then I explained why I had come. I did not dramatize. I did not accuse. I simply laid out what I had seen, what I had understood, and what I needed to confirm. He listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful, measured, as he reached for a folder I had not noticed at first. It was placed on the desk between us with a level of care that suggested its importance long before it was opened. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm, almost reassuring, but there was a weight to his words that settled deeply. He explained that Robert had made certain decisions years ago, not out of suspicion, but out of foresight, ensuring that everything we had built together would not be easily redirected or misunderstood. The details were precise, structured in a way that left little room for interpretation. Ownership, control, conditions, all clearly defined in a manner that required more than assumption to override. I listened carefully, asking only what was necessary, absorbing each piece of information without outward reaction. By the time the conversation ended, nothing about my expression had changed, but something inside me had become very clear. As I stood to leave, I thanked him quietly, not out of obligation, but because I understood the value of what had just been confirmed. Outside, the sunlight felt different, sharper somehow, as if the world itself had shifted slightly into focus. I returned to my car, sat behind the wheel, and for a moment, allowed myself to close my eyes. Not in relief, not in exhaustion, but in recognition. They had been planning for a future that did not include me. What they did not realize was that the foundation they were standing on had never truly belonged to them. The morning arrived quietly, with a soft light stretching across the room as the character sat near the window, holding a warm cup and watching the day gradually take shape, reflecting on the subtle changes that had been unfolding in recent days, not as dramatic shifts, but as small, almost unnoticeable moments that slowly reshaped perspective and awareness. There was a growing sense of steadiness, as if the earlier uncertainty had begun to settle into something more grounded and manageable, allowing thoughts to come and go without the same weight they once carried. The character remembered the guidance received earlier and noticed how it now seemed less like instructions and more like a natural rhythm of thinking and responding, gently influencing daily choices without force or pressure. As the hours passed, routine activities felt more intentional, from preparing meals to organizing simple tasks. Each action carried out with a quiet attentiveness that made ordinary moments feel more present and meaningful. Conversations with others during the day reflected a similar shift, with listening becoming more patient and responses more considered, creating a smoother flow in interactions that previously might have felt rushed or reactive. There was also a deeper awareness of internal dialogue, where thoughts that once triggered unnecessary concern were now observed with a sense of distance, acknowledged without being allowed to dominate the emotional tone of the moment. By midday, the character found time to pause and sit in stillness, not as an escape, but as a way to reconnect with a calmer baseline, noticing the breath, the environment, and the simple fact of being present without needing to add anything more to the experience. This pause revealed how much had changed not externally, but internally, in the way experiences were being interpreted and held. As the afternoon unfolded, small challenges appeared, as they naturally do, yet the response to them carried a different quality, one that leaned toward patience, clarity, and measured action rather than immediate reaction. Even when minor frustrations arose, they were met with a moment of recognition, allowing space before responding, which helped maintain a sense of balance throughout the day. By the time evening approached, the atmosphere felt calm and settled, with reflections on the day revealing a consistent pattern of gradual improvement rather than sudden transformation. The character recognized that progress had not come from forcing outcomes, but from allowing understanding to deepen over time, creating a stable foundation that could support future experiences. Sitting once more near the window, now with dimmer light outside and a quieter environment within, there was a sense of quiet appreciation for the simplicity of the day and the subtle strength that had developed through mindful attention, reinforcing the idea that lasting change often emerges through steady awareness and patient practice rather than immediate results. As the evening deepened into night, the room grew quieter, and the soft glow of a nearby lamp replaced the fading natural light, creating a calm and reflective atmosphere where the character remained seated, continuing the habit of observing thoughts with a steady and composed awareness. The events of the day began to replay in the mind, not in a repetitive or overwhelming way, but as a gentle review that allowed each moment to be seen with clarity and understanding. Interactions from earlier in the day were remembered with a sense of neutrality, recognizing where responses had been patient and where small adjustments could be made in the future, not as criticism, but as part of an ongoing process of growth. There was an increasing recognition that stability did not come from controlling every outcome, but from maintaining an inner consistency regardless of external conditions. This realization brought a quiet confidence, one that did not depend on validation or immediate results, but instead rested on the ability to remain present and aware through changing circumstances. As the character sat in stillness again, the breath became a focal point, slow and natural, helping to anchor attention in the present moment while allowing the mind to release unnecessary tension accumulated throughout the day. Thoughts continued to arise, yet they no longer carried the same urgency or influence, appearing and dissolving without disrupting the overall sense of calm. This shift in relationship with thoughts marked a subtle but meaningful transformation, where awareness took precedence over reaction and observation replaced automatic engagement. The environment around remained simple and unchanged, yet the experience of it felt richer and more grounded, as if attention itself had become more refined and capable of appreciating small details that might previously have gone unnoticed. Time seemed to pass without pressure, and the absence of urgency created space for reflection on the continuity of the journey rather than isolated moments of progress. The character acknowledged that consistency in practice, even in small and ordinary actions, had contributed to this evolving sense of balance, reinforcing the understanding that meaningful change often develops gradually through repeated awareness rather than sudden insight. As the night settled further, a sense of readiness for rest emerged naturally, without resistance or distraction, supported by the calm state cultivated throughout the day. Before resting, there was a final moment of quiet gratitude, not directed toward any specific outcome, but simply for the opportunity to experience the day with increasing clarity and composure. The lamp remained softly lit as the character prepared to transition into sleep, carrying forward a stable and ponk awareness that would continue to influence the days ahead in the same steady and understated manner. The next morning began with a quiet sense of continuity rather than a fresh start that felt disconnected from what had come before, as the character woke with a natural awareness that carried over from the previous day, allowing the mind to settle quickly into a calm and stable state. The room was filled with soft early light, and the environment appeared familiar, yet subtly different in perception, as attention now seemed more open and receptive to small details without becoming attached to them. Rising from rest, the character moved through the initial moments of the morning with a sense of ease, preparing water, organizing the space, and stepping into the day with actions that felt coordinated rather than rushed. There was no urgency to achieve anything immediately, and this absence of pressure created a foundation for a more balanced approach to whatever the day might bring. As the morning progressed, simple responsibilities were approached with consistent focus, and each task was completed with a steady rhythm that reflected the internal clarity that had been developing over time. Interactions that occurred during this period carried forward the same qualities observed in previous days, with listening taking precedence over reacting and responses forming after a brief moment of consideration, allowing communication to remain smooth and respectful. When unexpected minor adjustments were needed, they were handled without disruption, as the character had grown more accustomed to adapting without resistance, maintaining composure even when plans shifted slightly. Throughout the mid-morning hours, there were brief moments where thoughts attempted to draw attention toward concerns or hypothetical scenarios, yet these were recognized early and observed without engagement, preventing unnecessary distraction and preserving mental clarity. This ability to notice thoughts without following them became more natural, requiring less effort than before, as if the mind had learned a new pattern of functioning through repeated practice. During a short pause in the day, the character once again returned to stillness, sitting quietly and allowing awareness to rest on the present moment, with attention gently anchored in the breath and the surrounding environment. This pause did not feel like a separate activity, but rather an integrated part of the day, reinforcing the continuity between action and reflection. As time moved forward into the afternoon, productivity continued at a steady pace, supported by the same underlying calm that had been present since the morning, demonstrating that efficiency did not require tension or urgency, but could instead arise from clarity and focus. By maintaining this internal balance, the character experienced a sense of consistency across different activities, whether engaging in conversation, completing tasks, or simply observing the passage of time. As the day approached its later hours, there was an emerging recognition that the progress made was not measured by dramatic change, but by the reliability of this steady state of awareness that remained present regardless of external circumstances. Sitting quietly once more before the end of the day, the character reflected on how this approach had gradually become a natural way of experiencing life, where awareness, patience, and presence work together to create a stable foundation. With this understanding, the day concluded with a calm and settled mind, reinforcing the ongoing development of a more grounded and mindful way of living that continued to unfold gently over time. As another day unfolded, The character continued to experience life through the same steady lens that had gradually formed over the previous days, waking with a calm awareness that no longer required deliberate effort to establish. The morning routine began in a familiar way, with simple actions carried out in a measured and attentive manner, each step contributing to a sense of order and continuity. The environment remained unchanged, yet perception felt more refined, as attention naturally gravitated toward the present moment without becoming entangled in distractions. While preparing for the day, there was a quiet recognition of how habitual reactions had softened over time, replaced by responses that felt more deliberate and less influenced by immediate impulses. This shift did not create a sense of rigidity, but rather allowed flexibility to coexist with stability, making it easier to navigate daily situations with clarity. As the day progressed into work and responsibilities, tasks were approached with a consistent rhythm, where focus could be maintained for extended periods without strain. When challenges appeared, they were no longer seen as interruptions, but as part of the natural flow of the day, each one addressed with patience and a clear mind. The character noticed that energy was conserved more effectively, not by avoiding effort, but by engaging in a balanced way that prevented unnecessary mental tension. During conversations with others, there was a noticeable continuity in tone and presence, where listening was active, and responses were formed after thoughtful pauses, allowing communication to remain respectful and grounded. Even in moments where differing perspectives arose, there was no urgency to resolve them immediately, as the character had developed the ability to remain composed while acknowledging different viewpoints without internal conflict. Throughout the midday period, a brief moment of stillness was taken once again, not out of necessity, but as a natural continuation of the daily rhythm, reinforcing the habit of returning to awareness. In this quiet interval, the mind remained clear and undisturbed, observing thoughts as they appeared and dissolved without attachment, further strengthening the ability to maintain perspective. As the afternoon unfolded, the consistency of this approach became more evident, with actions aligning smoothly with intentions and the overall flow of the day feeling coherent and uninterrupted. There was an underlying sense that the earlier efforts to cultivate awareness were now integrating into everyday behavior, no longer requiring conscious correction at every step. By the time evening approached, the character reflected on the subtle, yet meaningful ways in which this ongoing practice had influenced both internal experience and external interactions, recognizing that the changes were cumulative rather than isolated events. Sitting quietly at the end of the day, there was an appreciation for the continuity of this process, where each day contributed to a deeper sense of balance and understanding, allowing life to be experienced with greater clarity, patience, and steadiness.